Welcome, dear participants of Move Days 2025. We are already on the home straight. Today is Thursday, the 6th Thursday, with one more to go. There are still 8 days to go. For the next 8 days, you still have the opportunity to collect points, move up in the ranking, and really push your company forward. Of course, you can also collect points for a good cause and help finance the next sports wheelchair. Today we have a very special guest. I warmly welcome Hans Holdhaus, a pioneer in workplace health promotion, sports scientist, and expert in HRV heart rate variability. Welcome, dear Hans.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here.
I have already given it away in the title. Heart rate variability is a topic that has become really popular in recent years. Is it also something new for you?
No, it's not. I've been passionate about this topic for over 20 years, I have to say. I have been dealing with this for so long, and there is not a day when I am not enthusiastic about the topic and what you can do with it. So it really is an inner drive and a joy to work with HRV every day, and in particular to possibly support people's health with it. And I think you can do that very well with it.
Yes, then enlighten us right away. What is heart rate variability, the much mythologized HRV? Why is it so important, and what is it anyway?
Yes, well, from my point of view, HRV is actually an absolute key indicator of our well-being, especially when you look at it in a work context, because it shows how our body actually deals with stress. So how much stress we have and whether we get enough rest. And right now, with the exciting challenges and sometimes long screen times and constant accessibility, I find it particularly useful. All these points, which determine the actual situation and are ultimately crucial to how this balance between activity and regeneration takes place, can actually be measured with HRV. You can think of it this way. If you have a permanently low HRV, then that is more or less a kind of warning signal. Namely, that it is possibly a sign that you are suffering from chronic stress and are not recovering sufficiently. I think that companies that address this topic in particular can really use it to promote their health or the health of their employees in a wonderful way. For example, just in the direction of what you are actually doing with the challenge. It fits perfectly with exercise breaks, with short recovery times, with stress management topics. You can do a lot with it. It's actually everything you could imagine. In principle, what HRV actually is, and explaining the term is also exciting. In reality, it is the time interval or the time fluctuations from one heartbeat to the next. And in contrast to a rigid and even heart rhythm, the variability is an indication of how adaptable you actually are. That said, just to be clear, if you have a lot of differences, a lot of fluctuations, then that's a good sign. Translated, it means I have good vitality. If I have a very even clocked system, if you will, it is exactly the opposite. Most people believe that it is actually the other way around, but with HRV, it is actually the case that these fluctuations, always from one heartbeat to the next, differences, if you have a lot of them, then it is a sign that you have a lot of vitality and thus also a high degree of variability and thus also a good ability to adapt no matter what concerns us, what comes at us. We can adapt better to all situations in life, and that is the truth.
The adaptability. Many of us are, of course, familiar with our pulse and heart rate. These are now also displayed on watches, of course, but 70 beats per minute is not just 70 beats. Is that right? It also depends on the nuances.
Exactly. It is precisely between these small milliseconds, which is actually shown in milliseconds in reality, square in reality in the HRV, and it is just not so, or it would not be desirable if you always have numbers 0.6, 0.6, 0.6. That would be, so to speak, this clocking. That would be a sign of a rigid system and, of course, therefore also little adaptability. But if I have 0.61, 0.64, 0.67, that's These mini differences are actually exactly the signs we like to see when the system is well set up. This is basically the basis for HRV diagnostics and thus also for making corresponding interpretations from these facts and data, objectively measured data, and thus supporting people and employees, for example.
You have already mentioned the topic of stress and HRV. Let's dive a little deeper into that. To what extent is HRV important for competitive athletes? They are, of course, also exposed to a certain amount of stress through training, for example. On the other hand, the modern office tiger is also exposed to stress, perhaps more mental stress. Is that the same? Is it different? How can HRV help us?
I would say basically, if you are asking how HRV is related to stress and recovery, how can you tell? Then I would say that HRV is definitely one of the best methods for measuring the current stress level and the level of recovery. In other words, to summarize again, is the HRV high? That does mean that the autonomic nervous system is balanced and your body can also relax well and is in a good state of regeneration. For example, if HRV decreases permanently, then this usually means rather the opposite, namely a prolonged stress load that cannot be adequately processed. Short-term fluctuations are completely normal and occur, for example, during training. This means that when you train, it is automatically physiologically clear that the HRV decreases. It gets worse, but in the recovery phase, which is also important, you will then see that the HRV goes up again. And now we have progressed so far in diagnostics that, for example, in sports, especially in high-performance sports, HRV is also used as an actual training tool because it can be used to control very, very precisely when the next stress stimulus is possible again and when it is not. And here you just have to recognize that sometimes it is better to take a step back than to do too much. In the truest sense of the word, the topic of overtraining can also be very, very well supported, for example, to ensure that this does not happen. And that's where I actually see the big benefit from the fact that you can control and support very finely, precisely, individually here. I think that's the big added value, and it makes it a really exciting tool.
These lessons learned from elite sports can now also be transferred to normal professional life. How can someone who is now under mental stress at work benefit from these insights?
Well, you can measure that very precisely. Namely, as a rule, if you approach it seriously, you usually take 24-hour measurements. This is virtually a state-of-the-art method. Why? Because it allows you to map an entire day-night rhythm, which I find very exciting. Many people also complain about sleep issues, such as problems not sleeping through the night or not being able to fall asleep. And we know from experience, and this is also shown by the studies, that especially when it comes to the topic of sleep, for example, that the foundations for it are laid during the day. This means that we take a very close look, and here we are back in the professional context, take a closer look at what actually happens during the day. That means, for example, if someone sits a lot, sits at the PC during work, you can see exactly with HRV when the system actually breaks down. So when, for example, does cognitive mental performance hit rock bottom? What are the consequences of this? The consequence of this is that you can then provide information. Hey, you have to provide something different to your system here. For example, in the simplest sense, an activity, getting out of the armchair, for example. In reality, it remains very banal and very low threshold as an intervention to simply deliver a different message to the body again immediately so that it is simply satisfied. So it doesn't take much effort to get the system back on its feet, as you might think. Instead, it takes a few small inputs. You do it. That's great with the move days, where all these inputs are actually always provided, and in companies too. So it's a great fit here. We can still measure it exactly, and of course offer the participant individual support and say, look, at these times it would be artificial to do this and that, maybe go a little more into relaxation there, do that there, maybe incorporate a digital detox time and so on. The intervention proposals are, of course, very broad and very diverse, depending on the outcome. And that's what's so exciting about HRV measurement, where you can simply go into depth with what I consider to be extremely manageable effort, because technology now allows you to have an ECG, so to speak, that is the size of a €2 coin. So it's also very light. You can wear it 24 hours a day, you don't even notice it. So I don't see any kind of restriction that would speak against it. On the contrary, it's really something very, very great that can be super helpful.
Absolutely. I think there were many important points. You said yourself that technology has been constantly evolving and has sometimes led to the fact that we now consider it normal to wear a smartwatch or perhaps a ring that does the same thing. There are also products like a Whoop band. There are a lot of different options out there, and that has certainly contributed to my understanding when I talk to people that this data has, of course, become more accessible. Parameters such as HRV have also become widely recognized in this way. However, there are probably still differences between a highly professional 24-hour measurement and a smartwatch. What are the differences? What do I have to watch out for as a user? Can I use it one-to-one, or how do I deal with it?
Thank you for this question. This is, of course, almost a classic because people always like to ask in this way. My watch can do that too, and then I can see the HRV. That is correct. Of course, I get information. My point is this. If you will, professional, that is really reputable, high quality HRV measurements are always taken exclusively via an ECG or via special chest straps that measure exactly these intervals very, very accurately. That is where the difference in quality actually lies. That is to say, the data is in principle highly precise and is usually also recorded over a longer period of time, which is why 24 hours is used. This means that it is actually highly reliable to obtain information and evaluations when there are also periods of rest. If you look into these wearables, as they are all called, the earring, VU, Garmin, everything, the many systems that are available that measure, and there's a concrete difference. They measure via optical sensors. This is a so-called PPG measurement, and in reality, it is inferred from the pulse on the HRV, so to speak. This is extrapolated, and this method can, and this is the crucial thing, show the trends well, but it is less accurate and also much more susceptible. And there it really goes up to over 30% susceptibility to interference factors, because in inaccurate measurement via these optical sensors, which then in reality leads to a completely false information. As a trend, where I say I look at it daily with a value, and whether it then rises or falls is of course perfectly actual, but objectively and seriously measured. It cannot be compared with an ECG measurement. So they are a valuable support for the average person, 100% in the sense of a daily self-check, but they certainly do not replace a professional HRV analysis, which can then also be used in the direction of stress diagnostics or also for performance control. You certainly can't do that with the watches and rings and whatnot, and it wouldn't be reliable because that also works. To name an example from sport, of course, these chest straps where you can measure it exactly when, as mentioned, you can do the training control. And if you now say that an office worker who wants to have an overview, if he occasionally looks at it and sees where the HRV is of course a first step. In fact, looking at our activities, I have to say that there is a very, very strong demand for and search for these high precision measurements, because the employees also want to know exactly what the situation really is and where they can really start. And I don't notice that so much from the watches or the rings, and that makes a big difference. I also notice it later in the counseling and support. That's actually the point. Now it's a 24-hour measurement.
Then they take measurements throughout the day and night, but of course not every day is the same. Some days are more stressful, and of course there are more activities at the weekend when you might stay up later and have a drink or two. Weekend and weekend are quite different for many people, of course. What is a good day to take a measurement like this? Are there days when you can't get any information if you catch the wrong one?
No, that's also a standard question. I can always answer that very clearly. Basically, the day is really not important in the base because the basic structure, the basic rhythms, if you will, that our vegetativum has, due to our lifestyle and what we bring with us genetically and what we do, they are usually very stable. The fact is that any change in my routine always has an effect on my HRVs. So, of course, it has an influence. And house number, as an example, you mentioned that before. If, for example, I never drink alcohol, and on a day when I do the measurement, I might drink a little more because it's just fun, because for whatever reason, then of course it has an influence, and that is also clearly measurable. And of course, when customers now take a measurement, the recommendation is also there that you should, of course, tell them, if it's in a professional context, take the measurement during a working day, of course, to get as transparent a picture as possible of what's going on. And even if these people take a measurement over the weekend, there are clearly other activities going on, but I always say that there is never a wrong or a right thing to do in this case, because you always have information that you can use. And you get an inner mirror in the activities, because that's cool. It's also conveyed in the form of an image, and you can work with it and do a lot with it. And in terms of understanding, it is actually very well received by the participants and the people you then advise, because there is not just a graveyard of numbers, but an image is also presented where you can better recognize these mechanisms. And then there are often those light bulb moments when he says, that was really incredible. I didn't think that this activity would lead to that, both positively and negatively.
Can you give a specific example of your experience?
You brought it up already. Let's stick with the topic of alcohol. For example, you can see what effect too much drinking has on our sleep. If you will, it is actually destructive. This usually means that our sleep phases are either interrupted or completely shut down, in the sense of, for example, anesthesia. It's like a narcotic sleep. That is the vegetative, our parasympathetic nervous system, our recovery nerve, pulls the plug, so to speak, and says, I'm completely overwhelmed. I can't get into the activity because the alcohol is there, and I have to process that first. That means you can see that this deep sleep phase, for example, breaks down completely, that you need hours for it until it keeps asking for it, so to speak. That's my motto. Can I do it just this once? Get into action in the sense of the recreation nerve. And if the system is still busy processing the alcohol, then it just doesn't happen. And that can sometimes be not just 1 hour, but many hours. And in fact, with maybe 7 or 8 hours of sleep, that person still gets. Recovery may actually only be an hour and a half. The rest is a processing of what happened before. That's how you can imagine it.
So even if many say, okay, I need another glass of red wine to fall asleep, or my calming drink after a stressful day, can that affect the quality of my sleep very quickly?
Totally. So it's always a question of knowing the dosage. The dose makes the poison, but primarily you can see that very well, and it makes it. In reality, it doesn't matter. Incidentally, it's the same with digital media. So anyone who lets a lot of stuff flow before they go to sleep and somehow connects digitally can see very clearly that the deep sleep phase, which is actually the most important and deepest, is often really reduced, and that it is postponed. We move these layers backwards, and actually, stupidly, of course, we reduce the quality where repair actually goes into the cell nucleus, then often doesn't take place at all, or only to a small extent. And that's actually a shame. And you can measure that, you can show it, and then it often really clicks, and you say, it's actually really stupid when I do it this way. So that also creates a motivation to approach it a little differently, and simply to support the system more consciously by perhaps avoiding these things. That's where we challenge ourselves.
You have already mentioned the topic of lifestyle. Of course, certain behavioral patterns become a lifestyle, or the behavioral patterns that we lead to our lifestyle. Of course, you can also influence that. What are the findings if you really have an active lifestyle? What is the longitudinal effect over the years, over the decades, whether you have an active or a sedentary lifestyle?
No, it has an enormous impact. I just had another consultation where a 63-year-old man took the measurement. And this may sound very strange, but the 63-year-old man is biologically 32. You can take incredible resources with them here as a bonus. Or you can also, and I see this again and again in the last 5 years, many young middle-aged people who are around 35, for example, but who are biologically 55, who have significantly reduced vitality for their age group. And here it must be clearly stated that the very basic principles of how the human body is built, so to speak, are at play. And as we all know, this famous balance is needed. And of course, there is a factor such as exercise, which is naturally associated with sports. And exercise can definitely improve HRV in the long term because it also trains the autonomic nervous system. Of course, special endurance sports such as running come into play because they tend to promote a higher parasympathetic activity afterwards, and this leads to an improvement in HRV in the long term. And we also know that there is a clear correlation between training and recovery. I mentioned this briefly earlier. This means that if you do a workout now, you know that your HRV will drop because your body somehow adapts to the stress. But when it recovers, the HRV rises again. And the classic case is when the hobby or health enthusiast often does it with the best of intentions, but in the wrong way. They train too often and too intensely because they are highly motivated and don't allow themselves enough recovery time. Then the HRV is permanently lowered and stays low. And it can actually be used to diagnose overstraining, overloading, and overtraining very well. And that is just as exciting for the athlete, but also for the professional person in reality, because there the topic is more likely to be the overburdening in the direction of overloading syndromes up to the burnout topic, to be very nicely presented. And with that, you can also catch people early on before they really start to have a problem without even noticing it. Because that is also something that I see very often in consultations, that many people do not feel what is happening. These brief changes usually do not solve the problem. The very subtle daily bad things that many do have a massive effect and then lead to this chronic stress, and then also to a chronically reduced HRV with little vitality, usually for the appropriate age.
Yes, I think there were some very exciting insights in there that I can also understand quite well from my time as a sports science director at Altasea, where, of course, we had a lot of types, manager types, who naturally always gave full throttle at work, who are high performers, and who naturally also bring this ambition to sport and are also high performers in sport. When they start training, they want to run an Ironman right away or run a marathon in a certain time, because this performance idea is so prevalent. And of course, you can quickly do too much of a good thing, dealing with too much at a high intensity, on the one hand at work, and on the other hand in sports. Sports are then no longer a source of relaxation, but an additional stressor. And then you drive the system against the wall.
Exactly. I can add another sentence if I can briefly add to you again or interrupt you. Especially when it comes to this form of hype in professional life, you can see that they slip into what is known as the continuous stress mode. You can see that very well at the AGM, for example, if you take measurements again and again, and we do that regularly with such groups of people, where you can see, and this is really exciting, that the heart rate itself naturally moves upwards day and night. This means that there is no longer an adequate reduction at night, but rather an approximation to the daytime level. When it becomes clear that things are going in this direction, then really big alarm bells ring. signaling that the system is actually in this continuous stress mode and can no longer adequately shut down. And then you really have to be clear about what needs to be done. And in this case, it is, of course, mainly about addressing the parasympathicus to activate the learning again, if you will, and to get out of this, one often says, hamster wheel. That is the challenge of figuring out how to do that. But it can be done well, and thank God there is positive evidence of it. When you take measurements again, you say, okay, look, this intervention is working, and that's why there's clarity and a certain lightness there too. I think that's also so important that you can then see, hey, with these smaller interventions, I've already taken the right step in the right direction again, and I think that's worth a lot.
The parameter, only for clarification, for all those you have now also addressed in the explanations, is the resting heart rate also?
Yes, exactly.
So the resting heart rate is also measured by the watches these days? Exactly. It can also be a good indicator? Great.
So not the simplest thing, but that's always a tip that's really an age-old tip, is to simply refer to the simplest thing, so to speak. You just measure your pulse in the morning every now and then, write it down in a notebook, and if you do it for more than 2 weeks, you can see that your heart rate is rising, then you know that something is not going so well. And if it stays the same or goes down, then it's usually a good sign. You can also recognize colds in advance, a few days before, that something is going on in the system. And that way you can take action again. For example, you can consciously approach training a bit more cautiously or try to reduce stress factors a bit more. To consciously go in that direction and see how your system reacts. Am I really getting into a problem? Do I get no idea, a cold, a flu-like effect? Or is that just a brief appearance of something that is somehow disturbing my system? And so you can actually have a simple solution for home use with classic heart rate measurement if you don't necessarily want to resort to HRV measurement right now. I always find that very attractive and simple too. Anyone can do it.
I would like to take up one more topic, also stress. The word has been mentioned so often in our session here. Stress is usually considered by many to be something negative. Is it? Is it always something negative?
No, not at all. We need stress to function well. I think you can always use this. There is also this comparison of short-term stress and chronic stress. So short-term stress is when you have something through an important meeting or an intense sports session. That is also short-term stress. As I said, the HRV will usually go down with that, which is also completely normal. This is not a bad thing, because as soon as the stress is over, if the system is well positioned, it goes back the other way. That means you recover and the HRV goes up. Chronic stress, in which the body actually remains in a permanent state of alert, as I just said, is problematic. And that's when HRV stays low. The signs of this are not being able to relax well and usually having poor sleep quality, so that even when you wake up in the morning, you actually feel like you've run a marathon during the night. And of course, in the long term, this can lead to the well-known health problems, such as high blood pressure, heart disease, burnout, and whatever. An example, again, in the direction of a manager: regular high pressure, little time, little sleep, few breaks, who doesn't treat himself, will certainly have low HRV in the long term. And in contrast, an athlete who purposefully uses stress management techniques, breathing techniques, whatever, everything that is available, will be able to quickly increase his HRV again after strenuous sports sessions, exercise sessions, because he has well integrated this mechanism. So it's always about, this balance, a sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, and paying attention to it again and again. And everyone has to filter that out a little bit for themselves. And that's why stress is never something fundamentally harmful. The constant stress is the issue. We have to be careful there and see what mechanisms we can tap into. Everyone has individual ones. Needs and possibilities for supporting his system in an individualized way. And one person needs more of this, the other needs more of that. You can filter that out with precise measurement, and then you can actually work very solidly, very seriously in reality with little. We hope that from my point of view, we have wonderful support here for high vitality into old age.
Yes, I think it's also important to see that research is increasingly showing that not everything goes downhill with age, that you can really improve even at an advanced age. Right? That it doesn't always go down. I can do something myself. There are many great examples that have managed this turnaround. In summary, I think it is fair to say that such a professional heart and parabola measurement and diagnostics are recommended for anyone who wants to know more about their health. The readings are good and provide trends and initial assessments, but for the details, you also have to look more closely between the individual heartbeats. If you now summarize this from your point of view, based on your experience, your 20 years of experience, what are the most important elements, the 3 most important points to increase heart rate variability in the long term and keep it up?
I am very clear about that in reality. From my point of view, point one, and this has nothing to do with my profession, just as you as a sports scientist, but nevertheless, from my point of view, they also say exercise is a medicine. So regular exercise, I say it consciously with the right balance, definitely has a massive influence on it. That is, as I mentioned earlier, endurance training promotes HRV in the long term. It is also important to know that too much training without recovery will lower it. So you always need to have this combination in the present. That's my first point. Of course, strength training is also part of it. So it's versatile, so it's necessary. We know that as we age, our muscles deteriorate. So we need a slightly greater focus in this direction from a certain age. But it's the mix that does it, the balance. I still think the second point is definitely sleep. So if we destroy our sleep because we just believe we don't need that much sleep anyway, then we'll hit a snag. Then, so to speak, the man with the black hammer comes. That means I think it's very important to have fixed sleeping times, if possible, good sleep hygiene that is dark enough, good air, no digital media inside. Why? Because we can definitely maximize our deep sleep phases, boost them. And that's number 2, I think. And number 3 is, of course, a more conscious approach to stress management. So that includes breathing techniques, meditation, going out into nature, being in nature, if you will, increases HRV immensely. I believe in exercise, optimizing sleep, stress management, and of course, a kind of conscious nutrition. We need a good substrate. We need good trace elements, micronutrients that support our cells, especially when there are many stress factors, constant stress. They need much more than substrate, which you often get little of these days from normal industrial food. You really need to supplement well. There are good solutions. That is also a recommendation from me. You can do a lot of good. And that's what I would say. The 3 most important pillars on which to build to keep your HRV high for a long time and to have good vitality.
Yes, there is nothing left to say but to add. So we are really putting the last days of the move days in the spotlight of HRV. You mentioned breathing techniques and breathing training. This session continues on 2, S day, the next and last 2, S day. Heinrich Meyer will show us some exciting breathing techniques. And then there is the last Thursday next week with me focusing on endurance training. That was your first point. I think we have covered quite a bit of ground for the finale of Move Days, and then our HRV still has something good to do. Dear Hans, I would like to say thank you very much. There were many exciting points. Of course, if you want to know more about who is professionally diagnosing HRV, I think we have the expert par excellence here. If you could just move down a bit, Holdhaus Nord, these are the contacts, the quality of life enhancers. They will do these professional HRV measurements for you and your team. You are welcome to contact him. You can also find the contact details with us. We will be happy to forward them and establish contact. Thank you very much, dear Hans.
Thank you very much for the invitation and for having me. I hope I was able to give you a few ideas that will help you stay healthy or get healthier. Thank you very much.
all the best, and let's step on the gas again for the last week, the last 8 days of the move days. See you next Tuesday for the breathing session with Heinrich Meyer. Goodbye.